You might ask yourself, do women participate less than men? In this room, certainly we've got some really active individuals, and all but one of you are women. So do women participate less than men? Well, looking at party politics, we know that only 22% of MPs are women. When you come down to local councillors, 31%. Members of political parties, it's a bigger pool, but still less. But when you get down to voters, women actually participate in elections, vote for political parties just as often as men do. In fact, women turn out and vote slightly more often than men do, but that's mainly to do with the fact that they live a little bit longer on average. So when you look at party politics, you've got this kind of fat shape with women participating equally right at the bottom, but at every stage you move up, women are dropping out. Then you look at the other side of the slide, civic engagement, the things that I imagine a lot of you in this room are doing, cause-oriented activities, voluntary work. We know that women are active and out there in society. For some reason, it doesn't seem to translate into party politics as well as it should do. Well, party politics is a minority sport. Only 1% of the British public are even members of political parties. So as you look at more and more active people in party politics, it really is a minority occupation. So maybe it just doesn't matter the women aren't there. But I would argue very strongly that it does. And that the women who have the skills from the right hand of the slide are ideally situated to make that difference. And actually, probably, we're all morally obligated to try and make that difference, because I really think it does have an effect on politics. There's a whole literature out about, a huge burgeoning literature about social capital. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the concept. And that social capital, like financial capital, serves a purpose as a resource, and it enables people to get on in life. It's the networks you have, it's those resources and connections you have with other people that maybe help you find that other job, that help you get that promotion. And argument has been, if we take social capital seriously, that women do very well in terms of some kinds of social capital. They have very strong personal networks that help protect them to some extent against mental illness, and that give and help them in terms of well-being. But they do less well in terms of the kind of social capital that's associated with getting on rather than getting by. So those powerful networks that plug you in to help you rise to the top. In this particular paper, what I show is that the strongest effect on political participation of social capital wasn't what kind of group you belonged to, it was the kind of role that you undertook within it. So if you're a leader, then that's positively associated with participating in politics. But if you're a befriender, someone who helps people out and gives them a lift and is kind to people, that's not associated with political participation. And if you're a foot soldier, so you're doing the thing that women have historically been really famous for, especially if we look at an organisation like the Conservative Party, making the cakes, raising the money, knocking on the doors, doing the general day-to-day stuff, is not strongly associated with participation in politics. And so my argument is, if you've got these women in these organisations, it's pretty obvious really, but they need to be pushed to take on leadership roles, because they're not necessarily going to put themselves forward. They're going to suffer from imposter syndrome. They're perhaps going to suggest, well, could I share it with somebody else, or perhaps next year? Actually, if we want to change things, we have to push people a little bit out of their comfort zone and push ourselves a bit out of our comfort zone and be willing to generate those resources that are associated with making change. So what about psychological engagement with politics? This area is where we consistently, over time and across country, see differences between men and women. Women are routinely found to be less interested in formal politics. So if you ask them, the standard survey question is, are you generally interested in politics? Women will say no, much more often than men. And my sense is that women tend to be turned off by the idea of partisan politics or the spectator sport or the fight between the parties. But actually, they're really interested in issues, and they respond to a more consensual kind of politics, and party politics can be terribly off-putting. Political talk, this is an area of study in political science. Basically, women report being less interested in talking about politics, and when they do talk about politics, it's often women talking to other women and men talking to men. So within women's own networks, they often underestimate their own knowledge. So in surveys that try and test where people think they are, against where they actually are. Women underestimate their knowledge. So they have more resources in this regard than they think they do. And women sometimes exclude themselves from political debate because they fear they won't be persuasive. So all of those things lead me to think that there's a role for us and for you women here to think, well, where can you find women who are engaged in networks, who can be persuaded to talk about politics, but do it in a way that actually is encouraging and encourages people to develop self-confidence rather than is actually too aggressive. I don't want to stereotype. There are lots of women like me who love an aggressive debate and will enjoy it, and I'm sure many of you in this room. But we do need to think about including all people, including people in the round. There are some people who will find that very off-putting and just trying to deal with issues in different ways. And then political knowledge. This is again an area where we see consistently in the research that women are less knowledgeable about politics than men. But this again depends on how you measure it. This might not be a complete surprise, but if you remove a don't know option from a political knowledge quiz, the gender gap in political knowledge halves, because women will say don't know if they're not 100% sure, and men will be more inclined to take a risk and guess if they're not 100% sure. And that means even if they're wrong 50% of the time in that guess, so even if their guess is not any better than a random shot at the answer, they will get a higher score in a political knowledge quiz because the women are just clicking don't know. So that already reduces the gap by half. But it also depends on the domain-specific knowledge. And I've had a conversation with my colleague at Nottingham, Phil Cowley, over the last few days about this particular piece of research, because when I read it, he thought it was hilarious because it was so banal. Because this piece of research says that if you ask women and men to name world leaders, men do better than women. But as soon as you add women world leaders into that mix, women do better than men. And women do better in the US at telling surveyors what the percentage of women in Congress is. Well, Phil started sending me pictures of tanks and asking me if I could identify and name them, and then said his male friends could, and that this was so banal it wasn't worth discussing. But I still think it's a relevant point, that as soon as politics feels relevant, there are women involved, women raise their heads and they start paying attention. So that's something, the problem is it's a bit tautological, there's a chicken and egg element to it. You need the women in politics to get the women interested. How are we going to create that virtuous circle where the women are there and so younger women think, oh, that's for me? And so it means there really is a role for political leadership here. Or I did a study in 2007 with Christy Winters where we asked people, if you were to open a newspaper and see the following articles, how interested would you be in reading each article? The state of education in Britain, the state of the National Health Service, British foreign policy, law and order, British partisan politics. Well, on the first graph, which is just general interest in politics, across the age groups, men's line is higher than women's. So there's a gender gap. As you can see, as people get older, they get more interested. I know personally it's quite hard when you've got very young children to pay as much attention as you might do, hopefully, a few years later. So you can see this curvilinear relationship. But what's striking is that gender gap, although it's fattest amongst the young, the mid-range, probably when the women are perhaps doing more of the childcare, it's persistent through that life cycle. And these were the items which were defined as domestic politics, so education, the NHS, law and order. And what happens to the men's line is it flips to be underneath. So we see the same kind of pattern where interest rises with age, but actually women are more interested right from the beginning. And so a lot of these measures of interest in politics, I think you ask women, are you interested in politics? And what they think about is the partisan politics. No, that's not for me. But if you ask them about the NHS, you ask them about education, you ask them about law and order, yes, they're interested, they have attitudes. We need to start to make the link between party politics and these issues, because at the moment, the only way democracy functions is by aggregating preferences through political parties. We haven't got another model. Another model might be great, but I don't know of one. And if we keep avoiding political parties because we think they're nasty and they're conflictual, and it's an aggressive and non-cooperative way of working, perhaps people have that view, we aren't actually going to be able to make the change because there isn't another way that we know of making democracy work. I would say not having enough women present in our elected bodies matters just from a point of view of justice. And Anne Phillips from the LSE has said this very eloquently in her 95 book, The Politics of Presence, that really it just matters. It looks a bit odd if a significant group of society are just not present in Parliament. it just looks a bit strange. We tend to think that something systematic might be going on. So that could be full stop as far as I'm concerned. But there are other reasons that it matters. Since women have become more involved in politics, the nature of our politics has changed. There's a whole wealth of studies out there about the link between suffrage and the welfare state, or suffrage and social spending. And there's a lot of work showing that actually spending on the welfare state and social spending went up after suffrage. And some quite sophisticated work looking at places where suffrage actually came in at slightly different times, comparing countries, so to see, is this really a causal relationship or is it just something that happened at the same time? No, it really seems to be the case. When you bring women into politics, for example, Switzerland only gave women full suffrage in 1971. So it's possible to look at what happened to social spending after that time. It wasn't just a general trend that was going across Western democracies. And so yes, women getting the vote really made a difference. I also would argue it matters because there's some evidence of elite mass connection in men and women's attitudes. And some research that I have done with Johnny Lewandowski and Sarah Childs, I think, is illustrative of this. So the first graph is hostility to traditional gender roles, so women's places in the home, that kind of thing. And what you can see here is that hostility to traditional gender roles increases amongst the younger cohorts. So people born after 1975 are very hostile to traditional gender roles. People born before 1925 are not very hostile at all. They're right at the bottom. And what you see persistently throughout that is a gender gap, with women being slightly more hostile than men, even in the youngest age groups. And then if you look at the slide on the right-hand side, this is attitudes to descriptive representation. This is, should women represent women? Should we have quotas to get women in Parliament? The strongest trend you can see is a downward one. So the older generations are more likely to say, yes, we should have quotas for women in Parliament than the younger generations. But look what happens to the men and women's opinion. Women's view declines, but it diverges from the men's. So younger women remain relatively hostile to measures that might improve women's representation that they might consider too interventionist, but they're not as hostile to it as younger men. What I would argue is that this shows there are variations between the way men and women think about gender equality, perhaps they're not even aware of. I certainly know a lot of younger women, these two views probably go together because, yeah, we hate traditional gender roles, we want to share everything. But because we're sharing everything and we're equal, why would we care whether we've got women in politics? And there's perhaps not a sense until people hit certain points in their family life or in their careers, oh yeah, that's why. Because actually sometimes there are presumptions about how things are going to be divided up, how life's going to be lived, made by employers and partners and lots of other people, just based on your biological sex, that maybe, not every woman has to face, but many, many, many of us do. And so I would argue that perhaps these younger women don't realise they feel differently about this from younger men. It seems members higher up the political food chain, this gender gap is there too. So if you look at hostility to traditional gender roles in the 2001 and 2005 British representation studies, so that's MPs and candidates, the pattern is magnified, and I think you'd expect this perhaps in a political elite where people have more coherent, or coherence perhaps the wrong word, but more solidified political views. This gender gap is really prevalent. So the women in these elite cohorts are more hostile to traditional gender roles and more in favour of the descriptive representation of women than men are. And I'd argue that suggests to me that if you have more women in Parliament, their views are likely to be more representative of the women voters than only having men in Parliament. And there are other studies that mirror this, looking at different kinds of attitudes. So I'd say it's a tentative link between attitudes and behaviour, but if politicians are going in more like women, with views more like women in the electorate, you hope that would manifest itself in how they behaved as parliamentarians. So that's another argument I would make for it mattering. And this is the final body of work I want to talk to you about, and this is the role model effect. And I think we all know that role models matter, but historically it's been quite difficult to get good studies of the effect that they have. But I think that the evidence is moving in the direction of showing that role models really, really matter, and that you in this room can make a difference. For example, the more that politicians are made visible in national news coverage, the more likely adolescent girls are to indicate an intention to be politically active. So that's from the US. Again, another study showing that, I think this is over several countries, that where there are female members of parliament, adolescent girls are more likely to talk about politics with their friends and to participate in politics. And then a lovely experiment that I would suggest you have a look at is published in Science magazine. It's only a very short little description, but they make use of a natural experiment in India where in 1993 a law was passed having reserved leaderships for women, crucially in randomly selected villages. So the villages where the women were going to be in leader positions were just literally chosen by lot. And so they were therefore able to compare villages where a woman leader hadn't been put in place to ones where they had. And what they found was that this improved women's young women's educational attainment and also their career aspirations. Just shows you that just turning on the TV and seeing a woman politician can make a difference. And then another similar study was showing similar effects, that in the US, the political knowledge gap shrinks right down to 0 in states where the legislature is 20% or more female. So that political knowledge gap completely disappears. They seem to be, obviously, they seem to be paying more attention to politics when they turn on the TV, and politics there's more women there. This is one study, but it's certainly interesting. And then another bit of research which I think is really relevant for us here today is a really nice study about partisan families, or the social logic of politics, that shows that actually historically political scientists thought that the man, the father, the male head of household was the centre of the political unit that was the family, and that any dissemination of values would come from the man. And actually what this research shows is that's quite the reverse. It's the woman in the house that has the impact. And that's not just in single mother households, that's in dual parent families. The mother seems to more often be the one who converts, has an influence, convert's a strong word, I don't think I want to convert my children, has an influence on their children, and vice versa. But the mother seems to be at the centre of that. And I think that's something to bear in mind too, is that if women can be persuaded that this is important and this is relevant for them, and yes, it might feel a bit uncomfortable, but engaging with party politics is what gives us the privilege of living in this democratic society. It is a bit dirty sometimes, it is uncomfortable, but it's really worth doing. They can have a massive influence on their own children in a way that perhaps men who historically were viewed as those who were the conveyors of partisanship weren't able to. So I think I've gone through some of this throughout my talk about what can be done. And this is probably where I'm most uncomfortable, because usually I don't have to do this. I don't have to say what can be done. I can just go out and say, well, this is what we found. But this is, now, this has got to be useful. You've got to be able to go away and do something with this. I do want to stress that politics is this minority pastime, and I don't want to make essentialist claims about men and women. Men and women in Britain today and in most Western democracies are more similar than they are different in their attitudes and behaviour. But some of these very small gaps that persist have this effect throughout the pyramid of power in this country that really matter. Women are not in the top positions of power where they're able to influence change and make a difference. But we know that there could be a virtuous circle where women are involved in activism, in civic activism, more than men are. And that they are there with those skills, and if they put themselves forward and get involved in party politics, that is when younger women get involved and get interested. So we could get this virtuous circle. We have this resource here available to us in this room. It seems to me that some of the evidence suggests that maintaining women-only spaces, or not completely women-only, but women-majority spaces, is probably useful. I've been involved in evaluating women's-only mentoring recently, and there is something about women being in those spaces together and saying, you know what, I don't feel confident about doing this, finding out other women don't too, having a shared cohort that they can actually work with and pursue political goals together. I think obviously you don't want that to go back to the days when you had a women's section and that's where you went and you were kept quiet and you did a bit of cake baking, although cake baking is fun. You want to do other things too. But actually maintaining some of those spaces I think is important at this stage. And the other thing is that women, at least some research from the US says women are less likely to receive encouragement to run. And one thing that political science shows us is if you knock on people's doors and ask them to vote, they're more likely to vote. If you ask someone will they put themselves forward for election, they're more likely to do it. If someone asks them, straightforward stuff, women are asked less often. We need to get out and ask them, especially as they're less likely to think they're qualified, so they're less likely to be pushing themselves forward. There are issues that women tend to think are more important than men do, although the differences aren't massive. If you asked anyone what the most important issue facing Britain today was, they would say the economy. But it might be that women have a different view of that they're concerned about preserving healthcare, preserving education, and so on. And other work I've done shown that women are more hostile to the spending cuts than men are. So there are issues that we need to talk about in order to bring women into politics, not exclusively. And bringing consensus in. Of course, politics is a fight over resources. At the end of the day, it's about holding power, wielding power. It's not always all about consensus, but it can be about bridge building. It can be about cooperating together. And we need to have, I know, all of us in this room can't change the media and the need for a punchy news story, but we do need to think about bringing women into politics and showing them an alternative view, that this can be about working together to make change. And I think my last point would be that focus on building confidence and efficacy among women, so that in your practice, whatever it is that you do help women to think, actually, I'm going to push myself that little bit out of my comfort zone, I'm going to say yes to that, and do it with the support of other women and other men around them, would be the key message. And that's it.